The presentation that I'm giving today draws on research that's been undertaken for the Gender Equalities at Work project, which is an interdisciplinary collaboration between researchers from the University of Edinburgh, University College London, and the University of the West of England. So it's very much a team project. So the findings I'm talking about here are not just me, there's a team that sits behind it. We're funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the project's overall aim is to produce the first comprehensive history of workplace gender equalities legislation since the 1970s, with a focus on law as action and as lived experience. It's around 50 years since the landmark legislation, the Equal Pay Act of 1970 and the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975, gave legal effect to the principle of gender equality in the workplace as a statutory requirement in the UK. But for the law to have any significance in practice, it needs to be mobilised, used, tested, critiqued, developed and expanded by those with the conviction and motivation to make it work. So our project seeks to tell this story and to analyse how change came about, with what successes and what limitations. We plot the trajectory of campaigning, legislating and litigating for equal pay and against sex discrimination across time, and we ask why, despite 50 years, particularly germane issues still remain as unresolved. Until fairly recently, the making of this legislation has tended to be seen as the end point of a historical narrative, sitting alongside histories of the women's liberation movement and of women's trade union activism of the 1970s, almost as a finishing point. But for us, it's a starting point, as we focus on campaigning strategies regarding gender workplace inequality, starting from 1970 and going up to the present. Campaigns were certainly stimulated by the women's liberation movement, which, as is well known in the UK, was associated with socialist feminisms and thus concerned with analysing the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy in order to challenge it. Indeed, equal pay was the first of 4 demands to be made at the 1970 Women's Liberation Movement Conference at Ruskin College, Oxford, and in 1974 at the equivalent conference in Edinburgh. Legal and financial independence for women was added as a 5th demand at that point, which is very pertinent to our discussion here. Educating women about their rights and providing them with advice and support, especially for those who are not in trade unions or part of unionised occupations and industries, was a significant objective of some of the new voluntary organisations of the mid-1970s and 1980s, such as Rights of Women, which was set up in 1976 in response to the 5th demand and is still active today. For our research, these 2 pieces of landmark legislation are just the starting point. They laid out sets of principles, but meanings and applications had to be tested. The Equal Pay Act, for example, did not initially include work of equal value, just like work. This was added in 1983 after the European Court of Justice found the UK government to be in breach of European law, in this case the Equal Pay Directive. In relation to the Sex Discrimination Act, what kinds of behaviour exactly constituted indirect discrimination, for example, had to be resolved because the law itself didn't provide the answer to that. So these pieces of legislation were tested across time. There was almost constant critique of them and advocacy to extend them. But through what means and by whom were they tested? Thus, we need to look at the law in action as something that was harnessed to claim rights and shift legal discourse, and as lived experience, as people brought cases, often at great personal cost. So who mobilised the law? Who educated women about their rights? Who supported complainants? Who argued for change? And what tools did they use? And how exactly were cases won and at what price? And what were the strategies? And how did they shape outcomes? Whilst campaigns for the Sex Discrimination Act especially were stimulated by grassroots women's organisations, if we follow the history of feminism through, we find it propelled by those who moved into occupational roles as lawyers, journalists, equal opportunities experts, trade union officials, policy advisors and femocrats within bureaucratic organisations. Thus, this is a story which begins with social movements and grassroots activism, but it also requires a different set of conceptual tools that enable us to analyse the work of key actors and protagonists in mainstream organisations and to study the process of active lawyering. In what follows, I want to do two things. So firstly, to comment more on methodology, on why an interdisciplinary approach is needed and what form it has taken for us. Secondly, to focus in on one particular strand within the project as an example, campaigning against workplace sexual harassment, which was judged to be a form of sex discrimination in 1986 in the UK, to provide a characterisation of campaigning phases from the 1970s through to Me Too. I'll finish by commenting on how understanding of its history contributes to current debates on legal responses. So, to talk about our interdisciplinary approach, does the law lead or does it follow? How might we develop and refine an interdisciplinary toolkit to answer these questions? The project draws significantly on sources that are historical, with a base in legal history and gender history, but it seeks to integrate these with concepts and frameworks drawn from feminist political science and sociology to develop a more sophisticated analysis of the relationship between structures and lived experience, and thus of change as a dynamic process. So on the left you've got sources that, and this will be familiar to historians in the room, I think. So the project is very much a work of gender history and labour history. It uses the empirical research methods that historians conventionally use, including extensive searches in all appropriate physical archives, the National Archives at Kew, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, the National Records of Scotland, the Modern Records Centre at Warwick, the Women's Library at the LSE, the Black Cultural Archives, etc. We've also undertaken extensive searches of a wide range of available digital archives, most obviously newspapers, online and parliamentary papers, and we've made use of oral history, both transcripts that have been collected by others for other projects that we can draw on, but we've also conducted our own interviews with 26 key actors, lawyers, litigants, campaigners, trade unionists and equality commissioners, and they're in the process of being deposited and catalogued in the British Library as part of the National Life Stories collection. In terms of law, can just say something about that briefly. Whilst trade unions might use collective action, most likely in relation to equal pay disputes, individual legal cases were brought through industrial and employment tribunals. So we're looking at cases that were both won and lost through the tribunal process across time, and charting the evolution of legal framing and understanding through case law. We also explore the relationship between the law enacted in the UK Parliament, UK case law, and EU law. The tools for analysing change and how it happens are outlined on the right-hand side of this slide. So firstly, in terms of structure and agency and how we grapple with that, our conceptual approach for understanding change as a dynamic process draws on the framework of feminist institutionalism developed within feminist political science, and in part as a response to the approach labelled historical institutionalism, which has analysed forms of path dependency in organisations. Importantly here, feminist institutionalism examines the ways in which organisations are both gendered and have gendering effects. So FI approaches in the past certainly have mainly been used to examine struggles over political recruitment and representation, the presence and influence of women within political parties, including the Westminster Parliament as well as devolved administrations. But we utilise them here to examine the tools and strategies that feminist actors were able to draw upon and use to promote workplace gender equality in and through a much wider range of civil society institutions, not just Parliament, as well as the points of opposition that they encountered and the forms of compromise and negotiation that were affected. So that's structure agency. In terms of scale, We're interested in macro, meso, and micro, familiar from sociology. But in fact, I think there's more of a sliding scale of concentric circles that we need to take into account and through which we need to range in and out. Thirdly, in terms of the pace of change, this is something that we're really interested in. And we find it very interesting as an interdisciplinary team that there are differing, although related vocabularies that are used in discrete disciplinary areas to discuss temporality, chronology, and the pace of change. For example, within legal studies, the biological idea of evolution has been used metaphorically to develop frameworks for thinking about law as a process of adaptation within a set of contextual parameters. The common law tradition of the UK has meant a narrow set of tramlines or agreed logics for the construction of a legal claim, which is de facto path dependent. Within history, Penny Caulfield has shown that it's useful to think about the multi-dimensional coexistence of and relationship between different temporalities, deep continuities or persistence, gradual change or momentum, and sudden rupture or turbulence. We've found it helpful to think in terms of gradual and incremental change for sure, but also about events and moments that are path-breaking, definitive or transformative, and whether and to what extent they create sudden shifts. But we've also been thinking about cycles and repetitions and reversal and movement backwards in terms of the pace of change across time. Perhaps unsurprisingly, other than the originating law, the Acts of 75 and 70, we have found change to be pretty much incremental, i.e. more gradual. Even the Equality Act of 2010, which for England, Wales and Scotland replaced the Sex Discrimination and Equal Pay Acts, bringing together a set of 9 equality strands, of which sex was just one, was in many regards a consolidating measure, bringing together things that were already set in play. Ultimately, let's move on to a nice diagram. Ultimately, the approach requires a multi-dimensional tracing through time of key actors, institutional architectures, in other words, the organisations that actors inhabited and worked through or across or encountered resistance from, and discourses, by which we mean here strategies of framing an issue through language and text. And a legal claim, I think, is in itself a discourse here. The challenges include complexity. We're looking at many moving parts, sometimes under the microscope, sometimes telescoping out. And this has meant that it's impossible to be comprehensive, to look at everything equally all at once. What we've had to do of necessity is to trace a limited set of threads, themes or strands of activity all the way through. And an important example of this has been longitudinal campaigns around workplace sexual harassment, which is what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about so that you can see how concrete findings are emerging. I don't know if you can see that, but yeah, it's good, is it? Sexual harassment as a concept relating to the workplace was first developed by women's rights activists in North America in the early 1970s. It spread during the course of the decade to inform women's movements in other countries through feminist networking and publishing. And the chart that we've got here provides the contours of the take-up of the term within the public sphere through a survey of 4 British newspapers. And it also demonstrates very strong correlations with international affairs and influences, especially US politics. So the term first surfaced at the far end, albeit briefly in mainstream British newspapers in 1975, through very limited and generally negative coverage, in fact, of American gender politics. A period of gradual take-up in the years 1983 to 89 was followed by a succession of peaks in the 1990s that were largely the effects of international news coverage of the politicised complaints made in the USA by Anita Hill in 1991 against Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas, and by Paula Jones in 1995 and Monica Lewinsky in 1998 against President Bill Clinton, and the impeachment hearings around that. Although sexual harassment never left the radar, the amount of coverage dwindled to pre-1991 levels during the 2000s, driven forward by new media platforms, including the Everyday Sexism Project website initiated by Laura Bates in 2012, and then seismically by Me Too in 2017, increases in references to sexual harassment in both print and online media were nevertheless inextricably connected. Across this time, sexual harassment achieved formal legal definition and social recognition as a workplace issue in the UK and also in Europe, elsewhere in Europe for that matter. Despite very considerable success, however, the journey has been mostly slow, by no means linear, and at times regressive and/or cyclical. Nevertheless, key moments or events include the things that I've got on here: the first formal landmark judgment in 1986, the conjunction of the European Union recommendations and code of practice for member states with the Hill-Thomas hearings, raising international awareness in the autumn of 1991, and further, in the first decade of the millennium, the direct prohibition of sexual harassment through statute law in the UK. Yet pulling out these moments of significance conceals the general pattern, which is one of gradual and incremental change with some significant reversals. So I put it up as a device here, because you can identify key moments, but actually there are different ways of looking at it. Within the sexual harassment strand and the tracing of a process that led to gradual change, there's another way of thinking about it. So we've identified 5 chronological phases associated with distinctive strategies, which were used by a gradually shifting cast of actors and institutions. Indeed, some actors went all the way through, and sometimes they did different roles within the landscape across time. However, the strategies we associate with each should not be viewed as sequential or stop-start, but as cumulative and multi-braided threads, with particular elements achieving emphasis or success at distinct moments, while others remained residual or less visible. They popped in and out of view. This is largely because key actors identified what were often narrow opportunities and worked within the constraints of institutions to use them as strategic resources, forming wider alliances and conditions to effect incremental change. So to take you through some of these phases in a little more detail. It was largely through women's activism within the trade union movement, and in particular the work of the white-collared National Association of Local Government Officers, NALGO, that sexual harassment began to gain visibility and traction as an issue of public debate in the early 1980s. NALGO's prominence in kick-starting this resulted from the conjunction of a set of factors at micro, meso and macro levels that created a policy opportunity, and thus it provides a useful example to alight briefly on here and sketch in. At micro level, there was a highly specific local problem, a case that was unsatisfactorily dealt with in the London Borough of Brent in 1979. At the meso level, there was a set of feminist actors within the union, both local and national, who were concerned with campaigning around women's and equality issues. There were comparatively new internal structures, equal opportunities committees and women's rights committees at branch and national level, through which campaigning might be orchestrated, although they worked within the old rules of trade union organising and decision making. At the macro level, there was awareness through much wider feminist networking of the emerging concept of sexual harassment and of the need for a broader policy framework to deal with it. There were considerable points of resistance within the union, including at branch level, and hostility and ribaldry from the popular press at the nature of the campaign. Nevertheless, the issue was fed up from the branch to the NALGO National Equal Opportunities Committee, who produced this leaflet in 1981, the first British trade union to do so. And in March 1982, the Women's TUC Conference more broadly passed a resolution as women worked across trade unions, which recognised that sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination that can damage trade unionists' morale, job security and prospects at work, And in 1983, the full National Trade Unions Congress produced its own leaflet of a similar title. The National Council for Civil Liberties and its Women's Rights Unit was also a key actor in this phase of naming, framing, advocacy and campaigning through its work in drawing together networks not only of trade unionists, bringing those together with radical lawyers, journalists and some politicians as part of a concerted campaign initiated in 1981. So they were extremely good at brokering network relationships. During 1983, the NCCL played an important role too in drafting model legislation in the form of a new sex equality bill that would explicitly prohibit sexual harassment within primary legislation, a new law, a new statute, as well as dealing with other loopholes and grey areas in the Equal Pay Act and Sex Discrimination Act. And this bill was introduced by Labour MP Jo Richardson as a private member's bill. However, the bill fell at the first hurdle, with MPs voting against a second reading because there wasn't a Labour Party majority, and it was a bill put forward by a Labour politician as a private member's bill. It's worth noting that two female Conservative MPs, Janet Fuchs and Elizabeth Peacock, chose to abstain, so they didn't vote with the government. But I think the bill was always likely to be more a campaigning and performative tool than a legislative strategy. I don't think they put it into place thinking that they were going to win it, although they might have hoped that they would do so. And it was to be over 25 years before sexual harassment did in fact appear in primary legislation or statute. Why do I talk about it here? Well, I think because the failed bill illustrates the difficulty of forming cross-party coalitions around women's issues, especially in the 1983 to 1987 Parliament. It was not simply that 97% of MPs were male, even though Margaret Thatcher was UK Prime Minister, but that neoliberal economics opposed measures that sought to regulate businesses further, whilst social conservatism constructed the new social movements of the 80s as cultural threats to national identity. And in this case, both these sensibilities had gendering effects in terms of what we thought about this bill and this legal intervention. Recognising the limitations of the parliamentary route, feminist actors turned to other mechanisms, judge-made case law, and to Europe. The legal framing of sexual harassment as a form of workplace discrimination, so the legal framing of it, was the direct result of engagement with the work of US legal scholar Catherine McKinnon, who had developed the claim that civil rights legislation prohibiting sex discrimination in employment also rendered harassment unlawful. So this is a really good example of transatlantic influence and the importance of McKinnon actually in the history of feminism across the globe. The 1975 Sex Discrimination Act had not made direct mention at all of sexual harassment, but it had made it unlawful to treat a woman less favourably than a man on the ground of her sex, or to subject her to any other detriment. And McKinnon's influential 1979 work, Sexual Harassment of Working Women, described the types of cases in which civil rights legislation that was framed in a very similar way could be brought to bear to bring a claim of sexual harassment. And she talked about two forms of case actually. Those in which female employers felt compromised intersex through threats of reprisal or promises of promotion, which was the quid pro quo formulation, and those where female employers were pressurized to leave their jobs through sexual harassment because of the creation of a hostile environment. And the argument was that these were actually detrimental. They were forms of detriment, and they were to do with a woman being treated less favourably than a man. The legal claim effectively asserted that if employers had no policy and procedure in place to respond to sexual harassment complaints, then they were actually vicariously liable for discrimination. So if their other employees behaved in this way, then an employer was also liable. Given that the drafting of the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act was informed by US civil rights legislation, that was one of the ways in which it was created, as well as the shared common law tradition of the two jurisdictions, UK feminist and radical lawyers suggested that Mackinnon's arguments were equally applicable, and this was of huge significance and was to shape feminist strategies for the next decade or more. From the early 1980s onwards, the Equal Opportunities Commission, or EOC, was hugely important in taking these arguments forward, prodded into doing so to some degree by the NCCL. And indeed, much of what follows is about the history of the EOC, and in particular its legal staff, and also how it worked with leading barristers and solicitors to bring test cases forward. The EOC had been set up as a new institution under the terms of the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act as an enforcement body with responsibility for promoting and monitoring the effectiveness of the equalities legislation, and for educating employers on the one hand about liabilities and employees on the other hand about their rights. It also provided legal assistance on a limited basis to claimants for cases that it deemed of strategic importance as part of its enforcement role. As a new institution, there were teething issues in its early years as it found its feet, and it was hampered too, I think, by limited resources. And it tended to be criticised on and off pretty much across time. This was inflected by its need to demonstrate independence, especially of government, but also from too close an association with trade unions or the women's movement or employers, a different balancing act. Nevertheless, there was demonstrable, although bounded space for feminist policy entrepreneurs and lawyers to work with and through the EOC to develop legal protections, including around sexual harassment. In 1983, 2 cases were won with the support of the EOC at industrial tribunals. Yet what was needed was a formal definitive written judgment at senior appellate level, i.e. through an appeal court, to establish meaning and set a precedent, a formal judgment that was written out and laid down. And this finally came in 1986 in the case of Strathclyde Regional Council versus Jean Porcelli. Employed as a school lab technician, Porcelli had faced a policy of vindictive unpleasantness, as it was described, from her 2 male colleagues with the deliberate purpose, quote, of making her apply for a transfer to another school. Porcelli had contacted her trade union but received no reply to her letters, so represented herself to start with. The case went through a series of hearings and appeals, and she finally contacted the EOC, who agreed to support her when the case was due to be heard in the High Court of Session in Edinburgh. The law lords who heard the case found that the behaviour used was, quote, a particular kind of weapon or sexual sword that was based upon the sex of the victim and would not have been used against an equally disliked man. Thus, sexual harassment was a form of sex discrimination under the 1975 Act. That is what the law lords had judged. The EOC, nevertheless, could only support a small number of cases. Unlike other forms of gender-based violence for which the rape crisis movement had been set up in the 1970s, there was no single advocacy or support group. It was for this reason that the single-issue organisation Women Against Sexual Harassment, WASH, was launched in June 1985 with an office in London to act as an advice centre and a service. The success of WASH was arguably a result of its more informal structure compared to the EOC, enabling greater agility and approachability. WASH was important in providing day-to-day advice to women who were not in trade unions or unionised occupations, or where trade unions, as in Porcelli's case, did not appear to be listening. And it also became an important advocate on the European stage, as we'll see in a minute. So we move on to European networking. The mechanism that campaigners increasingly also sought through transnational partnership was a European directive, piece of European law, which would require all member states to have primary legislation to protect women from sexual harassment. As sociologist Catherine Zippel has demonstrated in an important book on the European component of this, Europe provided new political opportunities for feminist campaigners in member states to work towards collaborative legal and policy objectives that were difficult to achieve at the level of national government. In part, this was because the European Union was not associated with a specific public sphere and only an emerging civil society, so that concerns about whether legislation accorded with public opinion that dogged national governments were replaced with bureaucratic processes and technocratic recognition of transnational expertise, including that of equalities professionals. Moreover, there was significant potential for femocrats working for the Commission in an official capacity to act directly as gender policy entrepreneurs. UK-based campaigners saw this as an opportunity to work with other advocates in other member states at multiple levels. And these transnational groupings pushed to bring a soft law recommendation to member states and an associated code of practice into effect in the autumn of 1991. Publicity surrounding this, importantly I think, coincided almost exactly with international news coverage of the allegations of sexual harassment made by law professor Anita Hill against Judge Clarence Thomas in relation to his nomination as the first black nominee for the Supreme Court. For the first time, sexual harassment was on the front page of all newspapers, whilst the hearings were taking place and in the immediate aftermath. In the weeks surrounding the European Parliament's approval of the code, its UK proponents used the Hill-Thomas hearings as a hook to promote its uptake by employers as good business sense. They capitalised on employers' fears of litigation, legal costs and bad publicity, which the spectre of the Hill-Thomas hearing had raised, even though Hill didn't win, technically. Moreover, on the European stage, transnational advocates continued to press for a directive, which was finally achieved in 2002, requiring all member states to ensure legislation was in place within the next 3 years to prohibit workplace sexual harassment. The final push for recognition of sexual harassment in primary legislation came under the new Labour administrations of 1997 to 2010. Labour Party general election manifestos of 1983, 1987 and 1992, when they lost, had explicitly promised to combine and strengthen equal pay and sex discrimination legislation, as well as to appoint a cabinet minister to promote equality for women across all departments. The 97 manifesto committed to a mainstreaming approach, building equality into all policy areas, although new legislation was not specifically mentioned in the manifesto. There were attempts and conversations and plans in the first Labour administration to create a single anti-discrimination body to work across gender equality areas, but government certainly seemed slow to orchestrate related legislation. And I'm cutting a long story short here, you'll appreciate. The whole issue of a new equality bill was finally included in the very last sentence on the very last page of the 2005 Labour election manifesto at the instigation of Patricia Hewitt, who fought for it as then Minister for Women and Equality. And it was delivered by Harriet Harman, who set to work on it as soon as she came into the role in 2007, so I guess after 10 years of Labour administration. Harman has described in her autobiography, A Woman's Work, the complex struggle to get agreement from other government departments and to take it through Parliament. And I think that was, some of the reasons why it hadn't come about. It wasn't necessarily prioritised by the government departments, and there wasn't necessarily a will to kind of take it forward. So it was a considerable piece of work to actually get this into place and to deliver it in the end. Thus, it was not until the very end of the third term of office that a new Equality Act received the royal assent on the 6th of April 2010, the same day as the general election was called. The new act, unique in Europe for adopting a multi-strand approach relating to 9 characteristics, including race, disability, sex, gender reassignment, religion, etc., came into being. But it provides a salutary warning not to leave flagship legislation until the very end of an administration, and maybe not to put it as the last sentence in your manifesto. One section never came into being relating to a socio-economic duty regarding assessing the impact of policy, and 2 other elements were repealed by the Conservative Lib Demolition Coalition in 2013 as part of the red tape challenge that involved getting rid of complex business regulation in the context of the austerity agenda. Significantly here, for us and the discussion of sexual harassment, this included an important clause that had made employers responsible for third-party sexual harassment, that is sexual harassment of their employees by customers and clients, and required them to have, sort of policy in place to deal with that. And in fact, that still remains a matter of contention. So that clause was lost and has not yet been regained. And there's still constant discussion about whether case law covers this or not, because there have been various reversals in case law. For gender equality actors, there had been a clear sense of job done by the early 2000s. I think that is clear. Considerable success in mobilising case law and creating European law had been consolidated in the 2010 Equality Act, despite the rolling back on third-party liability. It was particularly alarming then to see articulation of the problem once again around the international Me Too moment, which took off and spread from October 2017 onwards. It's a very particular window and moment. However, if we look at the sectors that became the focal point in 2017 and 18 and thereafter in the UK, it's perhaps less surprising. Arguably, they all relate to unfinished business, what had not been fully tackled previously. So, firstly, sectors such as the hospitality industries that are non-unionised, often highly precarious, reflective broadly too of changes in economy and the nature of work in the 2010s. But also I think the acting industry, one has to mention here, not Hollywood actors, but jobbing actors who are a part of equity, but are similarly based in casual labour and short-term contracts. And the point here is about casual contracts and precarious working is that making a complaint has significant future employment consequences, especially given lack of protection for whistleblowers, etc. So I think it's no surprise that that is where the focus fell. And clearly that was a growing body of the workforce. The problem has remained significantly worse too for those who are multiply disadvantaged across gender, race, socioeconomic class, because I think they're more likely to be in precarious employment, amongst other reasons. For those in hospitality, in particular, the lack of formal protection from third-party harassment by customers is a really key area, and that's where issues arise. And indeed, at the moment, it is the subject of a bill that's once again making its way through Parliament, and it will be interesting to see what happens there. It has had an element of cross-party support, which is interesting, supported by women MPs from across parties, but we'll see what happens. We've also seen in the UK significant scandals in relation to Parliament and political parties. Maybe this seems surprising, but maybe it doesn't. When we find out that really until recently they didn't necessarily see themselves as workplaces at all, so weren't thinking about themselves in those kinds of ways. And of course the other issue there is that this is where patronage systems have again remained hugely important and thus problematic in terms of how individuals are treated. Where there have been continuities, I think, in terms of where the spotlight has fallen since 2018 is in relation to male-dominated occupations, policing and the armed forces. And I've not said much about that in the early part of the presentation, but these were areas that were highlighted in the 1990s and early 2000s, but where problems have clearly remained and may even have worsened. And again, that's something that is unfinished business, I think, here. And finally, a point that I would make in terms of rediscovery is that an older generation of campaigners, I think, continue to highlight and to recognise that it's always necessary for every generation to be constantly vigilant. Unfortunately, these things don't go away. To conclude, understanding the trajectory of sexual harassment and how it is defined and framed, by whom, and how helps us understand the current moment. Feminist lawyers and policy entrepreneurs working within the mainstream used both new and established institutions and strategic resources to achieve pragmatic goals by layering in new rules on top of existing ones or converting existing ones. They did this with very considerable success, but they had neither the resource nor positional power to displace existing frameworks or effect a major change of direction. So it's kind of working within these limited parameters. Timing and sequencing mattered, and it shaped the outcome with sometimes unintended consequences. Sexual harassment was framed as a legal concept in relation to the workplace and employment law, specifically because of the tools available, Mackinnon's legal argument, the European Equal Treatment Directive relating to the common labour market, that provides you with a tool, but it means that the framework is one of employment law. So other routes, for example, criminalisation, which we have debates now about the criminalisation of misogyny and incitement to sexual hatred. Those kinds of routes were blocked off in this earlier prehistory. There were some discussions about it, but they were blocked off. They didn't present equivalent opportunities. Sexual harassment was delinked from other forms of violence or everyday sexism as a consequence in many regards, with codes of practice branded, as we've seen, as good business sense. In particular, the legal framing, despite the early involvement of trade unions, meant that it was treated as a highly individualised problem and not part of a broader system. Ultimately, therefore, it had been delinked from those broader grassroots feminist arguments and analyses that had acted to propel the concept into the public arena in the first place. And this delinking had undoubtedly enabled widespread take-up of the concept, so there was an outcome, but with the broader analysis diluted. So it's this trade-off, isn't it, between where are the opportunities, how can one achieve change within a realistic timescale, but what does one lose as a result? And that's a constant, I think, tension that people and campaigners and activists struggle with all the time.